Our second little video here is about sexual orientation theories. That is, where do we think being gay or lesbian comes from? These theories and how they're being evaluated, there have been several surveys to try to interview about both heterosexual and gay and lesbian childhood, adolescence, sexual practices, those sorts of things, to try to figure out which of these theories that people have posed are true, or what do we know about them. The by default theory suggests that heterosexuals have an unhappy or unsuccessful time at it, and so they become homosexual as a poor second choice. They've been rejected at some level, and so they are finding love wherever they can get it. And so this has the stereotype of homosexuals as being unattractive, and that if they just met the right member of the opposite sex, they'd be able to be turned back. And sort of side version of this is that lesbianism is because of resentment or dislike or fear or distrust of men. And what we find is that this is false, that 70% of lesbians report having had sexual experiences with men. Many also report having enjoyed it. The seduction myth is that homosexuals were initially seduced by some older homosexual, that homosexuality can be caught, for example, from a homosexual teacher, a homosexual coach, Boy Scout leader, that sort of thing. As far as that theory goes, that one is also false, that most homosexuals report that their first homosexual encounter was with a peer rather than a role model. The Freudian sort of model comes out of the idea of the Oedipus conflict, the idea that people are gay because in early childhood, when they were experiencing that sort of love triangle with their parents, that they had a dominant mom or a detached dad, or basically a weak opposite sex parent, and so instead of identifying with their same-sex parent, they develop an attraction. Okay, Freud's argument was that everyone passes through some sort of a homoerotic phase, but when the same-sex parent is not a threat, not weak, that this would cause fixation, where you are developing a gender attachment in the wrong direction. And so Freud did confound the issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. There is no support for the Freudian model that when we look at family structures and family dynamics and single-sex parent, single moms, that sort of thing, there aren't any differences in family structure families with gay or lesbian children versus straight children. In terms of psychological differences, the idea that maybe there's some sort of psychology of being gay or lesbian, that we find there is limited differences. I'll qualify that one. It's not a totally exclusive rejection of this model, but there aren't any differences in personality, no differences in psychological tests on gender identity, on intelligence. There are some studies, although it's mixed results, that find gay men to have a cognitive ability on spatial ability that's between straight men and straight women, and the same on verbal fluency. The stereotype is that men are better at spatial stuff and women are better at verbal stuff, and that's male and female brains. And so the fact that gays show up between those two, that they have sort of a hybrid gender brain, and that's found in some studies but not all. And of course they have left lesbians out of that sample. Is it possible that it was socialization again, we're confounding the issue of gender nonconformity with sexual orientation. So do we find that tomboys are more likely to become lesbian? And do we find that gays tend to be effeminate as children or engage in more cross-dressing as children or something like that? What we find on the gender nonconformity is a mixed bag, that we find, yes, more gay men and women tend to have engaged in non-conforming gender behavior. They report not being strongly masculine or feminine as a child, but we do also see 25% of straight men and 60% of straight women. And that bar is off. This bar should be up in here. So assume this red bar is up in this range. Oops. Women tend to be more gender nonconforming than men, but gays tend to be more gender nonconforming than straights, and there are still a number of straight folks that are gender nonconforming. So while there is a trend, it's not an exclusive trend or a diagnostically valid level of trend. Bem's exotic becomes erotic theory is the argument that you're more comfortable playing with the opposite sex peers as children, and so therefore the unfamiliar same sex then becomes exciting and mysterious and erotic. This is the idea that heterosexuals, boys will never understand girls, and women will never understand men. And so because they're mysterious, we try to figure them out, and we're interested in them, and so this forms sexual attraction. This one is also false. Most children, both gay and straight, have close same-sex friends, large proportions of same-sex friends, considerable contact with other sex peers, so they're not mysterious in some way, and that sort of thing. So and actually, we find that lesbians especially form emotional attachment from familiarity, from connectedness. And so that also seems to fly in the face of the EBE model. On the biological side of the equation, we have the idea of brain structures, brain functioning, hormonal structures, genetic structures. In terms of hormones, we find there are no distinct differences in adult hormones, and if there were, we don't know whether that would be a cause or an effect of the differences that would be observed. So there don't seem to be any hormonal differences in adults. We do find it's more possible, perhaps, that prenatal hormones affect brain structure, brain functioning, because we don't have the human studies to back this up because of ethics, but we do have some animal behavioral studies that suggest that we can manipulate behaviors so that if we expose, for example, prenatal female monkeys to more testosterone at the right time, that they would have female structures but would engage in more masculine behaviors. And the flip side for sort of getting feminine behaviors on the part of male monkeys and rats. In terms of actual observed brain differences, we have a mixed and kind of weak bag. People have been looking for brain differences for a long time, but the research is generally weak and not well done, with a lot of confounds and small sample sizes. So, for example, Simon LeVay's study finding the anterior hypothalamus smaller in gays than in straights had 19 gay men brains and 16 brains from males that were presumed to be heterosexual, and 9 presumed heterosexual women. We don't know for sure whether the presumed heterosexuals were in fact heterosexual, and all the gay men, we knew they were gay because they died from AIDS, and so we're out in that way. So it's hard to say whether those are real differences. What we find generally in the brain structure stuff is that it's so politically charged that when they don't find what they're looking for, they find some other structure that might be, if it's not the right size, then it's the right shape, or some other sorts of things. So the brain studies, I think, are, while mixed, show some political and emotional potential for bias. On the genetic studies, we see in this graph here that we have a 70% concordance rate among identical twins. So that would suggest that there are, and the study here shows, this is from Bailey, a 52% concordance among identical twins, 22% among dizygotic twins, and 11% among adopted brothers, with a pattern similar for lesbians. So this would suggest, yes, there is a genetic factor, right? We would expect, if genetics are involved, that fraternal twins would be more similar to each other than siblings, or unrelated others. And we would find identical twins to be more similar than fraternal twins. However, we don't see the concordance rate among parents and children. So these, you would think, if it was genetic, that the more gay parents you had, the more likely you would be to be gay, and that's not found. We don't find gay tracing in biological parent, adoptive parent sorts of studies, which leads me, at least, to weigh more heavily on the prenatal environmental stuff, rather than we're seeing this concordance rate among identical twins, but from heterosexual parents. So in summary, I think we find that there is not support for the choice or socialization side of things, and the research that we're finding on the biological side of things is more positive but not conclusive. So we've got still a bit of the jury is out issue here, and we do have to worry about the issue of bias in research, because given the political climate, it's really hard, it's difficult to do good quality research on the issue of sexual orientation, and so people don't get into the topic without having a vested interest and potential bias in the issue. So it's a loaded sort of question to be asking.